That's just what people do. But
Hey guys, I am back. That's right. Listen, I've had a friend ask me, he said, Tucker, tell me a little bit about education and how education has changed since the state has taken over. Well, I'm here to oblige, buddy. Here you go. I'm going to tell you all about education. So, back before the quote Civil War, if you want to call it that, which is a whole different video in and of itself. So, back in the antebellum United States, we worked education a lot differently. So before the revolution, we had, well, education was a commodity. It was something that people bought, sold, and traded, right? So the only people who really were educated were the people who had a great deal of money and a great deal of influence. It was really something for the rich, and everybody else was kept out of it for intentional reasons. I mean, obviously, when the people in power let the people who do not have power have education, you know what they say, knowledge is power. So as they got more educated, it got more dangerous. And that held within the United States all the way up until about 1780. So right around 1779, 1780, you know, as the U.S. became the U.S., you know, as we won the revolution and the government started to actually, you know, build and establish itself across the entire United States, education changed. Our founders knew, especially guys like Benjamin Rush and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and even, you know, Benjamin Franklin, they all knew that you had to have an educated populace in order to keep people from becoming too powerful, right? Education was what was going to save the republic. So they had something they called Mothers of the Republic, which were the daughters of the founders and framers who educated people on the ideals of a republic, on all of the things that you needed to know, not just basic education, not just elementary education as we see it today, but they educated on the responsibility of civics for all people. So people grew up, you know, being taught how important it was to hold government accountable for everything. And that's how things were taught back then. Now, the education system between 1780 and well, the Civil War was primarily monetary. Monetary not as in money, but monetary as in teachers were not educators as much as they were monitors. There were schoolhouses. There were roughly 80,000 schoolhouses across the U.S. And in those houses, teachers were responsible for about the same number of students as a teacher is now. Like the change is very little. In fact, the average, I believe, then for students in a classroom was about 27 to 30, and today it's about 25 to 30. So not a lot has changed in terms of that. What has changed, though, is that schools were spread out everywhere. You know, there were 80,000 schools or 86,000 schools in 1900, and there's 100,000 schools now. And of course, there are literally 10 times more students now than there were in 1900s. But the amount of schools hasn't changed. What has changed is that everybody's been pushed into big schools with different classrooms. So let's go back to the 1700s and early 1800s. The monetary system worked like this. You had a lot of very decently educated students and poorly educated students of all ages who chose to go to school. Now, I know you've all watched some movies and they've shown these schools where the kids get up in the morning and they hear the bell ring and they run off to school. That happens some in the deepest parts of the cities and mostly in the Northeast. But really, most school in that era was night school. Everybody farmed. Everybody was a farmer, including their kids. All the kids worked hard on the farm during the day. And in order to prevent them from having to always work hard on the farm, most parents would send their kids to night school. And at night school, they would learn all the things that were important in their region. So introducing regional school systems. So what would happen now is, you know, because people in Florida would need to know Florida things. and people in Michigan would need to know Michigan things, right? Because there's a whole different set of complications going from a place like Michigan to a place like Florida. Everything changes, right? So it was important to them that people learned in their elementary teaching that, the basic things you had to know. So moving on, so what would happen is all the kids in this area they'd go to their night school, and the kids who knew something would be pushed into teaching the kids who didn't. The belief of monetary school systems was that kids learned better by teaching. And I mean, that exists today. That still, to some degree, everybody I think who has taught has learned as much in teaching as they knew going into teaching. So kids who knew more were, forced to learn what they knew better by teaching it to younger kids. Nothing will teach you more about a subject than trying to teach it to a kid, because you have to start figuring out ways to express it that a kid will understand. And that was the core of education throughout the early 1800s. So the teacher was a monitor. She would come and make sure that there was, good behavior, and that the curriculum was consistent, that the kids were teaching properly. But for the most part, teachers, they weren't making a lot of money. They were barely making anything, and they weren't super responsible for actually imparting knowledge. The kids taught each other, and they grew together. Each kid would have a strength. Each kid would bring something. Each culture would bring something. So all of the students would learn together with guidance from the monitor. And that education system produced some of the greatest inventors of all of time. Guys like Benjamin Franklin, who went to school when he was 8 and got out when he was 10. He has 2 years of formal education, if you want to call it that. It has invented some of the most amazing things that ever existed, and is probably one of the most influential men of his era. So, the education was a lot different than it is now. Much of it took place at home, and much of it was taught from student to student. So then, okay, I want you to understand, to be clear, you understand this. They didn't want people gaining power, so they wanted education to be universal, for everybody to have it, and have everybody to have access to it. But they weren't real fond of the idea of having it funded by the government, because they knew that once the government started funding education, it would start directing education, it would start controlling education, and it would start telling people what they needed to learn. Enter the Civil War. In the years between the beginning of the Civil War and 1870, every single state passed laws that required funding for education. Every state had a publicly educated school. Now, there were still a lot of private schools, but they had all created this broad, vast network of publicly educated schools where, everybody started having to pay for it, which means everybody had to go, which means everybody had to be able to pass. Now, here's one of the biggest problems with socialism. Now, conceptually, it sounds like a good idea. Well, if everybody has an education, everybody will be smarter. The problem is, when you force everybody to pay into it, then everybody's going to say, well, my kid's not doing well. I'm paying for the same education everybody else is. You need to find a way to get my student doing better. And the solution to that is always to dumb down the quality, right? As participation grows, quality decreases. That applies to everything in the world, every market you can imagine. Every time somebody says, well, I'm going to give something away for free, well, guess what happens to the quality? It disappears. So now in the 1870 area, all the states went over to publicly funded elementary school. Now, it was still like it was in terms of elementary was just that. It was for an elementary education. It was for the basics of knowledge. And it was still voluntary, mostly voluntary at that point. And in that, you could choose to grow, or you could choose not to grow. You could go to elementary school when you were 30 years old and start learning, or you could go when you were 4 years old. And as long as you could keep up, you could keep up. And then after you finished elementary school, you got to decide, okay, if I'm going to go to college, I need to go to something that's going to prepare me for college, mainly because at the time, most of the classes were taught in Latin. So everybody had to learn Latin if they wanted to go to college, and not every elementary school taught it. Along came secondary school. So you had elementary, then you had secondary, which we call now junior high and high school. In secondary school, you were taught, you were prepared for college. You were prepared for higher education. They taught you all the little things that you should know going into college. Now, understand that even up until the early 1900s, colleges had no educational or academic requirement for entrance. Some of our founders had never gone to a day of school in their entire life and then went to Yale with no prior education. And they were able to keep up, so they were able to stay in because it was, people, you pay for an education. And the education system saw it as, well, you pay us, we will offer you good information. What you do with it is your problem because we're not forcing you to be here, you're choosing to be here. So if you're going to be here, you're going to choose to learn or choose not to. We don't care as long as we're getting paid. So colleges didn't pass you because they weren't compelled to. They didn't care. They passed you because you did well. If you couldn't keep up, that was your problem. You were paying them. So enter the progressive era, right? Suddenly everything changes. Now, the progressive era could arguably have been started right at 1875. A lot of people like to pin it closer to the early 1900s, but really what happened was the Civil War, the War of Northern Aggression, I call it, ended the constitutional republic that was the United States prior to that. That was the end of the constitutional republic. From that point on, it was the national democracy of America. It's no longer the United States of America. It was the national democracy of America. They nationalized everything from that point, and that kind of is what progressivism is. It's, well, we're going to make everybody do the same thing because we think it's better for everybody. So that's what happened. So in the early 1900s, you had guys like Horace Mann who came along and changed the philosophy of education, who said that, well, education doesn't need to be as much about preparing people to be successful in their own adventures. It needs to be about preparing people to be more considerate to others and to be more giving to others. The Horace Mann and the Dewey philosophies were, society won't get along as long as everybody's learning how to fend for themselves. We need to make everybody fend for everybody. And that's where the focus went. It went from maintaining a free republic to creating a democratic community of people who were taught to give everything to each other. Now, again, it sounds like a great plan, and if it worked in real life, it would be. But these benevolent, altruistic people really do believe that humans are different than other animals, and in some part we are, but the reality is that some humans are still animals, and that no matter how much you try and make everybody the same, we're not going to be the same. We are totally different creatures. That, you can't force that on us. So anyway, we go into education again. So we get into the early progressive era, and education suddenly becomes compulsory. Now, for the first time in history of the world, except perhaps for the Prussians. The Prussians, I think, may have introduced community education like that. But, for the first time in at least American history, people were being told they had no choice but to go to school or be punished for not going. So as students were being pushed into schools, things changed. Now, again, when the United States first started, about 1 in 3 people were actually being educated, right? By 1790, 2 in 3 were being educated. We went from 33% to 69% in a matter of 10 years. And that was just because we knew it was good to offer it. That was without it being compulsory. People could choose to go, but they just knew that it was better to go. We get into the 1900s, and all of a sudden we're going from 69% to over 80% because now it's against the law to not go to school. Now, really, if you think about it, that's only about a 10 to 12% increase by making it, lawful. But that's what they did. And in doing so, funding became a problem. So the government started doing what the government does. Hey, we have a problem. What can we do? Oh, we'll tax people and we'll throw money at the problem. That'll fix it. Because every time we throw money, it helps things, right? People are no better educated now, and I would argue they're less educated now as a whole than they were then. When people went to school by choice, people learned by choice. But when you send people by force, they don't learn. They complete tasks. They jump through the hoops. They do the things they're told to do, and they forget it all after that. And school starts to focus more on quantity than quality, and that we've seen that reflected in reality. Yes, there are more educated people now, but they are less educated. In fact, one of the funniest stories I've ever heard, I can't think of her name, Mary something or other, right at the end of the Civil War, had gotten a hold of a bunch of the letters written from Northerners who are, the educated North. Everybody got free education in the North leading up to the end of the Civil War. She got a hold of all these letters, and she compared them against letters written in the South. The spelling was abhorrent. The grammar was non-existent. These Yankees who were all educated, who had all graduated from school, were incapable of writing a coherent sentence in their letters. The Southerners who were educated, granted, fewer of them were, but the ones who had actually completed education were actually better educated. They knew more. They spoke correctly, and they actually knew how to write. So, yeah, more people were educated, but more people were less educated. So now we get into, the mid to early 1900s and into the 20th century. The FDR era comes along. So FDR was an anti-elitist. Okay, he did oppose elitism as it had been accepted up to that point. But he was also a big middle class. He bought into the communist belief that you have to have a strong middle class in order to function. Everybody needs to be equal in order to function properly. So, he started changing education again. And in doing so, what he ran into was that some of the people in his organization, they saw the Great Depression. They saw that there were a lot of people who were out of jobs, a lot of union people. They had just successfully built all these unions, which I still say is why we had a Great Depression. Thank you, unions. So the unions brought the Great Depression. And then while it was happening, they all said, look, we can't risk all these new students coming out of these schools with, skills that will make them competitive in our industry. And FDR agreed. FDR actually limited the technical skills that would be taught in schools because he didn't want the union workers to dislike him. His thoughts were, well, we can teach them the things they need to know to be entry level, to be at the very bottom rung. We don't want to teach them real world skills anymore. That was old thinking. That was antebellum thinking. We want to teach them the things that'll get them started and get them into society, make them all feel like they're educated, but we don't want them competing with the really ingrained union workers who don't want to lose their jobs. And that's where education took the big turn downwards. It was already sloping down that hill. But now, education went from at least trying to better people, even though progressives made it more about, politics than about education. Once you got to FDR, it went straight to, all right, education is now about creating classes and dictating classes. And not only are we going to do that, but since we, the federal government, are now going to take over all education, now it is all truly state-run education. Even private education is not allowed to teach without state approval and state curriculums, right? So now that the government has control over education, the government has control over what is being taught. So why do we not look at them as the bad guys? because they are teaching us that they're the good guys. You are taught that FDR was a great man who did great things. Why are you taught that? Because FDR took control of the education system so that he could teach you that his ideas were the best. You were being raised, you were being indoctrinated to believe that the new progressive education system is the correct way, that this is the best way, it's the most benevolent way to teach everybody, that we all need to be a good working part of the middle class, but that unions are more important, and that we need to have structure in society from the high earners to the low earners, and all these things need to be dictated to us. It's nonsense, people. It is nonsense. We are now looking at a time, and I think the best example is this. Up until the 50s, a high school diploma meant something, right? Because it was hard to get. An education in elementary was not so hard to get, so it didn't mean anything. You couldn't go to an employer and say, hey, look at me, man, I've got an elementary school education. And they'd go, yeah, well, so, right? But up until the 50s, you could go to an employer and say, look at this, I am holding a high school diploma, right? Throughout all of history, if you held a high school diploma, that had value. But with the introduction of compulsory high school education and federally funded high school education, what happened to the value of a high school diploma, right? Because they had to lower the quality of a high school diploma in order to facilitate as many people as possible so that they can justify taxing everybody and paying for all this education. Now the high school diploma doesn't mean anything at all. It means nothing. In fact, it hasn't meant anything for a good 20, 30, maybe even 40 years, right? Because it's free. And let me tell you what free things are worth. What you paid for them. Nothing. So once the high school education became valueless and had been basically disintegrated into what used to be an elementary education. You're not learning anything in high school now that students weren't learning in elementary school 150 years ago. So what are they doing? Well, now everybody has to go to college. Now everybody's got to get an associate's degree. So for the last 20 years, we've all been told we have to go to college. We have to get, even if we don't know what it's for, we've got to go to college and get that degree. So now everybody's got one because they've made it affordable. The government's throwing money around so everybody can go to college and everybody can get an associate's. Now go to a business and say, hey, look at me, I'm holding up an associate's degree in blank blank. And they're going to go, so? I don't care. That doesn't mean everybody does. Everybody who applies here has that. That's nothing. It doesn't mean anything anymore. Why? Because you didn't pay for it. If it's free, you get your money's worth, right? It's not worth anything. So now we have everybody saying, well, we need 4 years of education. We need 6 years education. What's going to continue to happen here is they're going to continue to improve access and funding for education. And in doing so, they're going to push more people through it, which means for more people to get through it, they have to lower the quality of it, make it easier. Because, if it's hard for my son and I'm paying for it with taxes and you need to let him through. So, okay, we'll make it easier so your son and everybody else can graduate. Yeah. So in another 10 or 15 years, a doctorate, it's not going to mean anything because everybody will have one because it'll be pretty much compulsory, right? This is the failure of our education system. This is the failure of progressivism, of socialism, of this, benevolent societal ideal that everybody has that, oh, well, we'll make life better for everybody by teaching everybody. It's not working. It's not working. We need to back out of this nonsense. I could ramble on about this all day, and I know you're going to have some questions, and I want you to hit me with them, but listen. I want to thank you guys for watching. I want to thank you for subscribing. Please hit like, and you guys get out there and get educated for real. Forget this. Get educated.